happening. Yeah.
Yeah. So we are live and welcome all of you to our esteemed lecture of CSRF. It is a 12th lecture and I would like to call Rushati ma'am for a brief introduction of our resource person, Dr. Preetha Vasan. Over to you, Rushati ma'am.
Good evening, one and all. Tonight, this task of introducing our guest speaker has truly been an honor. It is with deep pride and humility I introduce Dr. Preetha Vasan, an extremely enthusiastic teacher with 23 years of teaching experience. Currently, she is teaching the master's program in English at Jyotinivas College, a premier women's college in Bangalore. Primarily an academician, she has published many research papers and has guided many research students, including me. And her areas of interest include trauma studies, mythology, conflict studies, diaspora, and partition literature. Her short fiction and poetry have won several prizes and have been published in a number of anthologies and e-magazines. And her first book was a collection of poems based on the Mahabharata, and it's called the Yagna. It's called Yagna. In 2022, she published the Chronicles of the Crimson One, The Rise of the Yakshas, the first book of her young adult mythological fantasy fiction series. And on behalf of the entire team of Vallat and the Research Forum, Cultural Studies Research Forum, I would like to welcome you, ma'am. And I'm looking forward to hearing you after a long time. I'm sure everyone will have a very nice time. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Rushati. Thank you, Dr. Vallat and Koel. Yeah, it's very nice to be here. Though I'm not a very big fan of this online platform, but I think that is one way to also connect. So you're going to see me struggle a bit with technology. I also have a problem with my laptop, but I've kept it there. So I've hired this laptop, so I'm not comfortable with this new one. So if you see me fumbling around with my key and all that, that's the reason. Okay, so we can start the presentation, Koel.
Yes, ma'am. Let me share the screen.
Okay, we will start. That's the title slide. Yeah, my topic, I've just called it this. It's called Representing the Unrepresentable, Trauma and the Graphic. As we go on into the presentation, you will know why I have called it, why is it unrepresentable and why is it in quotes, all right? Yeah, let's go to the first slide. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, now, I have started by telling you what trauma is, right? It is an emotional response to a terrible event. As we progress into this talk, I'm going to challenge this opening definition itself, all right? However, we'll go with this for now. I would prefer to come to this later, but we are going to start with this. So typically, this is the definition that you get, an emotional response to a terrible event. It leads to a number of consequence when you are exposed to a terrible event. What are the consequences? It first of all shatters an individual's emotional wellness. Now, at this point, I would also like to say that originally the word trauma in Greek meant a physical wound, but in this talk we are very specifically talking about psychological wounding, right? So affects the traumatic event which causes trauma, affects the person's sense of emotional wellness, and changes that person's psychological organization, which means the mental makeup, the mental structure, leading to a questioning of identity. Now, this might be a sociological problem, but also once mental makeup changes, once there is a fracturing of one's psychological makeup, that also leads to a questioning of a challenging of one's identity. When I say questioning of one's identity, a traumatized person, a person who has gone through a traumatic event or continues to go through traumatic, which we will come to later, can never go back to a pre-traumatic selfhood. So in that sense, the identity remains changed. Trauma also leads to a person's alteration of the person, how the person looks at the world around, also changes completely with trauma. So a lot of things that I'm going to talk about today is around this opening definition that I've given about trauma. Now, before we go to the next slide, this word is kind of bandied around in the 21st century and the 20th century as if it's something we discovered very recently. Okay, but I would say that trauma has been there. I mean, it comes to us from the West, like the novel form. But trauma has been there as, way back when Herodotus, the man who wrote the first history book called the Histories, he talks about a marvel that occurred in what he calls the Battle of Marathon. All right, and he talks about the story of this Athenian named Epizelus. And Herodotus says that Epizelus could not Suddenly, Epizelus could not see at all, which means he lost his power of sight, even though Epizelus had no single injury on his body. So this becomes a classic example, an early example of trauma, because what has Epizelus witnessed? He has witnessed horrific scenes before him, and he's so mentally affected. So though he had no physical injury, he still loses his power of sight. Okay, so here is Herodotus talking to us about this in 450 BCE, even before we come to the 20th century. So I thought I should specify that before we go to the next slide. Yeah, we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are some, we'll hear more names and more important events. Okay, the first person to actually connect a trauma to a psychological to the psychology of a person, to psychological wounding, is in fact this French physician Jean Martin Charcot in 19th century. All right, this was the first recorded breakthrough in understanding and treating conditions induced by trauma. Now, Jean Martin Charcot was in fact treating women who were diagnosed with what is called hysteria. All right, which means they showed symptoms like convulsions, they lost their senses, symptoms which were associated, interestingly, with the uterus. All right, which if you're familiar, since you're also familiar with Victorian literature, you will probably make the connection here. So one of the treatments for hysteria was, the suggested treatment then was hysterectomy, which was the removal of the uterus. Interestingly, the word hysterectomy itself comes from the Greek word hyster, which means womb. So the word hysteria actually comes from a word which goes back to the womb. And so that's what 19th century physicians thought, that only women were prone to hysteria, and the cure for hysteria was to remove the uterus. But Jean Martin Charcot was the first one to diagnose that the cause for hysteria was not in the uterus, but in the psychology of the person, and because the person has been exposed to some violent experience. In the 1880s, we have Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud, who likewise conclude that trauma was result of what trauma is, what we're talking about is psychological trauma, even though we talk about physical trauma and things like that. Now, the concept of trauma or the understanding of trauma also develops further with World War I, when soldiers returned with what was then termed as shell shock. You have Sassoon talking about it, right? You have the war poets, Wilfred Owen talking about it. So that's again trauma, shell shock, or what is also called battle fatigue. And these soldiers showed very similar symptoms like hysteria. In fact, they had uncontrollable weeping, screaming, memory loss, and physical paralysis. So the term enters another domain now, as I'm trying to show you. Of course, this term has gotten completely associated with the fourth bullet point, the Holocaust. So survivors of the Holocaust, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, were survivors of concentration camps. There, of course, trauma becomes more, trauma studies intensifies, and psychologists like Henry Crystal tell us how these people are so traumatized that they are unable to imagine a future or cannot see themselves where they're going and things like that. You also have ideas like their inability to speak about their trauma, their prolonged traumatization causes them to go into silence. Um, then we come to the Vietnam War, right? So in the 1980s, the word PTSD, which is now very commonly used, the full form of which is post-traumatic stress disorder. This enters what is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, third edition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. If you've done psychology, this is called the DSM of the APA, right? So this enters PTSD enters the diagnostic manual, and PTSD is what the Vietnam American war soldiers come back with, right? And it has an entire chapter now. The DSM brings in an entire chapter on trauma and all those disorders. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. Okay. So trauma and literary studies, which is what we are going to look at. In fact, I'm going to go a bit ahead and in fact show you trauma and the graphic novel and how it works. All right. So how do we intersect trauma and literary studies? This is a very recent area, in fact, develops as a result of Holocaust literature. Um, that's again problematic, which I will come to as we later on in a bit. But where do we locate trauma and literary studies? Trauma and literary studies looks at psychological trauma, the function of memory in recalling or its inability to recall this traumatic experience. How do we represent, or how can we not express represent traumatic experience in language? Okay, so when we engage with that kind of a study, when you are going to engage with a text which is produced in the context of trauma, and but sometimes it is not even obvious that it is trauma, right? But you, through an approach, through the approach of trauma studies, it is possible to uncover a lot of things. So, what kind of a theoretical model we use for literature produced at this context? It is interdisciplinary, which means we use psychoanalytical theories, which is what I'm going to do. We also use literary and linguistic theories, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and of course, we are going to look at post-colonial theories as well. So that's the interdisciplinary model to look at works like this. Now, literature also looks at, how narrative becomes a very important vehicle to represent trauma. So you also have trauma studies engaging with the way narrative changes itself when we talk about how language is shaped when somebody is narrating a traumatic experience. So such studies also look at technical innovation, narrative innovation, the memory process, the whole concept of the unreliable narrator, because somebody is traumatized, so you can't really rely on what they're talking about, right? So that's what I mean by an interdisciplinary model. Now, Sigmund Freud, he's the father of psychology and all that. But today, a lot of psychologists don't agree with many things that he says. But Freud has a important role here. The Freudian model is what trauma studies builds on its subsequent theories. And Freud introduces us to those concepts that I've put down. Latency is a delayed response to the trauma, which means which I'm going to show you, and I need you to keep these terms in mind, which means you have experienced a traumatic episode. It stays in your memory and then it comes back to you a little after. Okay. That is also because of the next symptom, which is disassociation. One way of escaping. I mean, there is a lot of scientific analysis for this, but we don't have that kind of time, and that's not what we're studying here. So because we don't want to internalize it, we kind of, the mind sort of, like how we when we get the blood congeals when we have a wound. So similarly, some part of the consciousness cuts us off from the traumatic memory. That's what we mean by disassociation. Now, Freud saw trauma. So Freud located trauma in the memory. Okay, he saw it as an effect of something that has occurred in the past. So he saw trauma as psychological pain, pathological. The memories are. So what is where is the pathological problem in the memory, right? So one way that Freud suggests that we can cure trauma is treat trauma is by this process which he calls abrasion or the talking cure. We are going to challenge this talking cure in some time. Okay, so this is the basic model that Freud gives us. It's important to keep these things in mind when we come to discussing the graphic novel. The next slide is going to, you can move the slide because I think there's a few little delay in the slide. You can just move to the next slide, Koel. Okay. Okay, while the slide is coming up, so the what like we have many waves of feminism and things like that. We also have first wave of trauma studies. Is there a reason you're not able to present the slide?
Ma'am, can you share the slides with me? I'll share the screen because Cole somehow left the chat.
Oh, I'll have to mail it to you and all that.
Okay. Okay,
How
I'll
do I?
call Cole and
Because I don't have it here. I have not.
Sorry, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am.
Is she back?
she's
Am I
back.
audible?
Yes, yes,
Yes,
yes.
Cole, you
Yeah.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide,
Yeah.
Kopi.
Rushiti, please
Yeah, I
make
have made
me
you the
host.
host.
Sorry.
Otherwise, I can.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
made you
please.
the host. Just check.
Because of my technical issues,
Okay.
yeah,
Now I can share the
yeah,
screen.
you can
Ma'am,
go.
sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. That's okay. I mean, that's all the problem with technology. You can go to
I hope it
slide.
is visible.
Yeah, you can go to slide number 5, please. You can start from beginning and move. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, this one, correct. Okay. Yeah, so we are talking about, so anybody who's going to do this area of research, these are the triumvirates you must know. Okay, they're all Western critics, but these are the three you have to know. Kathy Karuth, Shoshana Feldman, and Jeffrey Hartman. Okay, they are the first wave of, in fact, they bring in a lot of concepts. Okay, so one is, so Karuth, this is in her book, Unclaimed Experiences, Trauma, Narrative, and History. Karuth is the first one to introduce us to this whole idea of how trauma fractures consciousness, which means it irrevocably damages the psyche. That's why I said in the beginning, the traumatized individual can never go back to a pre-traumatized psyche. Okay. Second, she also talks about this. This is why the title, if we will now connect it to the title, this is why she also talks about, she says the traumatic experience cannot be represented at all. Okay. And what does she mean by that? The second one, the point which I have not missed, but she talks about the paradox of trauma. What is the paradox of trauma? Trauma is both absent and present. Okay. So in our, so we have our narrative consciousness, which means a consciousness which has assimilated an event and we're able to talk about it, right? So that is our narrative consciousness. But trauma is an unassimilated event, right? So it remains outside our narrative consciousness, but it is not that it is absent. It is still, it is absent from our narrative consciousness, but it is present and an unassimilated event outside our normal memory. So it is here that it exists in a kind of a wordless state and still inflicting pain. Okay, so that's why she says trauma is unrepresentable, right? Right, and how, so when we come to literature, we also have to look up how this leads to a challenge, lack of linguistic representation. And that's why the graphic form becomes a very important aid for this kind of, this kind of representation, right? Yeah, so that's what she means by lack of linguistic representation. Yeah, you can move to the next slide. Okay. All right. Now, all trauma studies that had emerged, especially the first wave, it was all from the West, and all cultural scholarship in this field often cited Cathy Caruth, Feldman, and then you have also Dory Law, Dominic Lacapra. These are the people who really developed trauma studies. All this work comes out of engagement with one history, Holocaust, Holocaust literature, and Holocaust testimonies. So the Western model uh, is marginalizes other traumatic experiences, especially traumatic experiences of non-Western minority cultures. Okay. Important name in this is the critic called Steph Krapps, who has an entire book on, who has an entire series of lots of books on post-colonizing trauma studies and things like that. So he argues that other traumas other than Holocaust should also be given recognition and should be acknowledged on their own terms. Okay, it's ethically wrong to compare one trauma to another. Nobody's pain is identical, isn't it? Now, there's an interesting book by Ethan Waters, which is again has an interesting title. It's called "Crazy Like the U.S: The Globalization of American Psyche." Okay, Crazy Like the US, the globalization of American psyche, where Waters critiques this grand project where America, of Americanizing the world's understanding of the human mind. Okay, and he calls it a neo-imperialism of another sort, because here is, this, for example, the American Psychiatric Manual has decided that it can define everybody's trauma and provide solution to everybody's trauma, right? So kind of universalizes traumatic experiences and universalizes solutions, right? It's like it has found answers for all mental illness all over the world, right? Now, particularly these critics have challenged the DSM's definition of PTSD, which was in fact my first definition of trauma, an emotional response to a single event. See, a specific event. The problem is with the article there, a, because what happens to people who continue to live in traumatic conditions? Think about people who live in poverty, who live. What about people who are exposed to caste? What about people who are exposed to racial abuse every day? People's sexism is attacked, or ableism of society. So what happens to people with disability who have to go through the trauma every day? So this Western model makes those kinds of traumas, shall we say, invisible, right? Hides it from us. And so you have all these kinds of trauma models that have now emerged because of multicultural scholars who want to understand, they've diversified this model, right? Who want to understand the impact of racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, ableism, and other forms of structural oppression that individuals go through because they are either cultural minority or they're a collective minority. And that is why the last two bullets. Okay. Um, do we have any questions? Can I just, I think my charger is coming. Can I just check this call? Just give me 1 second, please.
Yes, ma'am. No problem. Friends, in between, if you have any queries, you can put it in the chat box.
You can move to the next slide also.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, you have to unmute.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'm guessing many of you are quite familiar with this form, so I'm not going to talk too much about the background. Okay, again, the call comes. 1 second. So are there any questions so far? Nothing, right? Okay, so this is just to how a graphic novel looks. Can we go to the next slide? I'm just going to quickly tell you about this form. Okay, so when it started, we also call it the graphic or the comic form. Though it's called comic, it is not funny, all right? Originally, it was used for that kind of a literary representation, but now, and it was often considered as lowbrow, especially by highbrow, highbrow, especially highbrow literature. But it is now seen as quite serious literary works, and it was also seen as just junk. You know, if you're reading, let's say, for example, your comics, you're told why are you reading just such junk. But we are not going to see that like that any longer. It is now considered a very important area and a very eminent, eminently possible area, especially to represent trauma. Okay, Scott McCloud, who has the who has this book called Understanding Comics. The book itself is written in a comic form. He gives us the first time, he gives us a definition of what is a comics. So I'm going to use the word graphic, not the word comics. So he says how the graphic form, see, it juxtaposes two things: pictorial, right? The visual. Visual is not just the picture. You're going to see how the pictorial involves a lot of other things and also other images in deliberate sequence. It is organized in a specific way, even as a narrative. When we choose a third person or first person narrative, is a conscious choice an author makes. This is also a specific choice to convey information and to produce a certain response in the author. Okay. So the film form, in fact, is a very, very slow comic form. So comic form is actually showing you movement, right? Even as a narrative proceeds through tempo and things like that, the comic shows you spatial and temporal movement through certain features. I'm going to quickly run through those features because I was not very sure how many of you were familiar with that form. Okay. This is another important name. This is Hilary Shute. Um, one second, please. The curse of the online, I think, just a minute. Yeah, sorry about that again. Okay, so Shoot is another important name, Hilary Shoot. She calls it a hybrid form for a particular reason because it has both the visual and the verbal. You will see all this when we get into the texts, okay? She also tells us that one should read them non-synchronously, which means the visual is not a replacement for the verbal. You have to, that means you cannot say, the visual or the verbal is representing the visual, you see, which means you don't, so you have to read it simultaneously. Okay, so it's not like, oh, the visual says this, so the verbal is also going to say the same thing. No, the visual will say one thing, the verbal will say something else. Okay. Will Eisner's name is again important because he's the first one. He's not the first one to have used the term graphic, but he was the first one to call his novel, it's called The Contract with God. He was the first one to call it a graphic novel. Okay. He also says that the only thing that you cannot, which is there in the graphic novel, which cannot be duplicated in any other form, is this called, um, yeah, I think I will take questions later. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think it's Hirsch. You can talk. Hirsch talks about intergenerational trauma studies. HIRSCH. Okay, so he talks about this thing called gutter. Okay, and that's something which cannot be duplicated in any other literary, any other narrative form. We will see what the gutter is. We can go to the next slide. Next slide.
Yes, ma'am. I have changed it.
You
The
changed. Okay.
flannel tire gut.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, these are the, like we have, features of narrative, right? We have narrator, you have the focalizer. Um, okay. And then, yeah, we're going to discuss all that. I think you have to hold on to your enthusiasm. It's nice, interesting that you're asking questions, but it's also distracting me from the screen. So we'll come to the questions in the end, and then most of your questions will get answered through the presentation. Okay, so when you look at, if you can you see those rectangular boxes? I'm going to show some slides in a bit. So just to give you an idea the right ways, and most of you must have studied comics. So the rectangular or the squares on the comic page that um, contains both action and conversation, that's called the panel. Okay, so there are multiple panels on a page. So to read a comic, you move from one panel to another. Okay, the next point, tier, this is the arrangement of the rows. You see the panel arrangement. Usually there are 3 in a row or 2 in manga per page. Okay, and then third word, gutter, what you normally think is the ditch. This is not that gutter. Gutter is, if you look at a comic, you will find there is a space between the panels, right? The space okay. So when a panel, bleeds into the edge of the page, it's not there here, but that's called a full bleed. Okay. Splash is, this is a splash. Can you see the cover page is a splash, which means this is where either the cover page or the main, the introduction to a section. So which means there are no panels. Okay, so it occupies the entire page. That's called a splash. Usually you will find it at the beginning or at the end or when we begin the chapter. Okay. Splashes are generally in color in order to be impressive. Now, these are all very conscious choices writers make to do something. Okay, and that's what I'm going to argue through my presentation. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, spread is a step up from splashes. Spread incorporates usually, this you'll find in Art Spiegelman's mouse. The entire, it spreads from this end to that end. Okay, so that is what is a spread. This is not used very often, but it is used to create some kind of an effect. Now, speech bubbles are those, have you seen when you read comics, you have this bubble coming out of a person's mouth. That's called a speech bubble, so that you know what the person is saying. When it is a thought bubble, then it is like a cloud, right? So I'm sure most of you have read comics. Okay. Captions, sometimes this is when the authorial voice comes in. The author says something, that's the caption. Okay. So these are usually rectangular and put in top of the boxes. Now, comics also uses sound effects, right? So sometimes if the speech balloon is jagged, yeah, you can go to the next slide, no problem. Speech balloon is jagged, then that means that person is shouting something. Comics also use sound effects through onomatopoeia, like for example, plop or drop, drop, drip, drop, you see. For that matter, Eliot had already used it, interestingly, in The Wasteland. Okay. Yeah, now somebody was asking me this question, how do you narrate trauma? Okay. This is Anne Whitehead. This is a good book. People who have been asking me for books, this is a very good book, trauma fiction. Now, yeah, so she talks about how narratives, okay, try to represent trauma. Okay, novelists have frequently found can be adequately represented by mimicking trauma itself. Okay, so supposing you're narrating a traumatic episode, you're not able to talk properly, then the narrative also gets fragmented. Then you have gaps in the narrative. You say, like, for example, a traumatic person cannot recall properly, right? So there are narrative gaps. You say, so a character says one thing now, one thing later. Normally, a traumatized person has no sense of, like we said, psychological wounding. So there is a spatio-temporal collapse. This again comes through narrative collapse, right? The use of repetition, digression. These are all choices you make. I've given it in point form how a narrative can use this. This is just an understanding. You will see how this works in the graphic. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, yeah, this is again Judith Herman, trauma and recovery. So trauma memories usually lack verbal narrative. Typically, when you say, "I'm so overwhelmed, I can't talk about it," right? But I can. It's almost like I can see it in front of my eyes. That's when graphic becomes very effective because it can show the visual. So don't we say a picture speaks 1,000 words, right? So the visual can capture what the verbal cannot, right? So they're often worded in vivid sensations. Similarly, we are going to see how a trauma can also, I mean, a graphic can also represent unassimilated traumas, right? Trauma remains unassimilated. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, trauma, these are all what you have on the left column are all symptoms of trauma. They have an emotional impact. Traumatized person often has fear of repetitive episodes of the trauma, so they don't want to be there, they're scared that the traumatic episode might repeat itself. This might become triggers for pain. Traumatized persons have nightmares. They want to disassociate themselves from the traumatic episode, feel helpless. And then, of course, there are other symptoms of trauma. So, we are going to see through the study of two graphic novels how, through visual clues like the panel size, now icons is something I've not spoken about. Icons are now the face also. There are a lot of features I've not spoken about because I don't have the time, but I will touch on it when I explore the two texts. So icons are, for example, you will see when we come to Munu, all the Kashmiri Muslims are represented through the icon of the Kashmiri endangered species, a deer called the Hangul deer. This is a technique that Spiegelman uses in his graphic novel Mouse, where he shows all the Jews as mice and the Nazis are cats. Okay, so that's an icon. Icon also can become facial expression, one particular image. Then, as I said, using spreads. When does a author use splash repetitive imagery, like you will see in Munu, the graphic weight, combination of words and images. So all this becomes very effective way of representing trauma, which is otherwise Karut says unrepresentable. Yes. Next slide, please. Okay, Vanni. So that's the first book we are going to look at. This is Vanni. This is the book. I'm not going to go at it in great detail, but I'm just going to quickly look at how the graphic works. Okay, you can ask me to slow down if you want me to slow down, but I think this is the speed fine. Can I go a little faster?
Ma'am, I think it is okay to all of us.
Okay, fine.
It
Okay.
is okay, ma'am.
Yeah, so Vanni is I'm going to argue that Vanni is a representation of collective trauma. And also to engage with this trauma, the Western module of trauma studies, which only looks at the individual and a single traumatic episode, does not work. And that's what I'm going to show you. So we are actually going to do somewhat a kind of, challenge the first wave model also. So in Vanni, what I'm going to argue is what we see is a representation of collective trauma. Okay. I'm going to start with the last point there. Vanni is an area which consists of 3 districts. Okay. I mean, not three, more than 3, but these are the 4 main points. I'll show you the map in a bit. Kilinochi, Mullaitivu, Bavunia, and Mannar. Vanni traces, I'm not going to go into the history of the Sri Lankan Civil War, but Vanni traces the last phase of the Sri Lankan Civil War, which ends in May 2009, a period where close to 300,000 Tamils were caught in this zone called Vanni, which comprises of these districts, Kilinochi, Mullaitivu, Vavunia, and Mannar. And they were caught between the Sri Lankan SLA, the Sri Lankan armed forces, bombing them and attacking them from the land, and the LTTE, who were using them as human shields. Okay, Now, when the war ended, the Sri Lankan government under Mahinda Rajapaksa announced that they have put an end to terrorism. They refused to acknowledge the human rights violation that happened in this area. So Benjamin Dix and Lindsay Pollack. So this is a testimonial. So this is not a graphic novel. It's a graphic narrative. Okay, that is why I have called my title "Trauma and the Graphic." This is not a novel. It's a testimonial that Benjamin Dix and Lindsay Pollack have come out with. They brought it out. It came out 2019. Benjamin Dix is in fact a United Nations, United Nations worker, official from the United Nations. He was sent to this area in 2004 when Vanni was also affected by the tsunami. And then he continued to stay there, and he saw the violence that people were put through, the human rights violation there. And he talks about this in the acknowledgement in the book itself, where he says that when he was sitting in the bunker taking protection from the air raid, he read two books, Art Spiegelman's Mouse and Palestine, another testimonial, right? Paco's Palestine, and that stayed with him. So afterwards, in 2008, when the Sri Lankan government forcefully evacuated um, Dix and other UN officials from Vanni, when Dix went back, he said he had PTSD and he wanted to do something with his trauma before he could, break down. And that's why he brings out this graphic novel. The pictures in the graphic novel, they are illustrated by Lindsay Pollack. So in a graphic novel, you always have two artists, the writer and the artist. So Lindsay Pollack is the one who's the artist, and he has used a number of Benjamin Dix's photographs to bring out the graphic novel. So they call it a non-fiction fiction, because this book is based on stories, testimonies that people have shared with them. But they use two families, Antony's family and Chulagar's family, to talk about people's testimonies. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is the map of Vanni. You can see Jaffna there, Mullaitivu, Elephant Pass, and all that. This was the human rights atrocity that was committed here. Mahinda Rajapaksa was not brought to books. In fact, he was given the Commonwealth Chairman Office Award. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, this is the cover of Vanni. As you can see, it's a spread. You will see why this point is important. That is Benjamin Dix and Lindsay Pollack. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so why collective trauma? What is collective trauma? This is a quote from a psychologist who worked with Daya Somasundaram, a senior professor of psychology who worked with Vanni survivors. Okay, so it is a very specific research which looks at a particular trauma that people went through only in Vanni. So this is how he defines this collective trauma, a complex psychosocial impact or not just the individual, but also in communities. Okay. This is the next quote is again from psychologists who have worked with Vanni survivors, who say that in collectivist communities, it's very difficult to differentiate between the individual and the outside world, right? That distinction becomes blurred. And because for individuals, the community also becomes important. The community, their identity comes from the community. Trauma results from the loss of such a community. Okay, so if you look at the opening, this is a spread. Notice there is no panel at all to show you how they are not individual families, but their identity comes as a collective, right? So these are the Ramachandrans, they are the Cholagars. The trauma will result because of this fracturing of this collective. But here already you can see that the war has made its invasion. You can see Ranjan and Jagjit, they are in the the LTT uniform. Therefore, their expressions are also different. Okay, yeah. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this Vanni begins in exile. This is Antony, who is in exile in England, and you can read the speech balloons and look at his facial expression. Also, if you look at the extreme, not this panel on the left, but the right panel, you see the speech balloon going out of the panel. It's almost a bleed. That's what we mean by a bleed, right? The speech balloon is outside the pan. This is also a visual way of indicating how outside the, the reality, or the outside, the Western Eurocentric, the Eurocentricized Western individual is unable to understand Antony's trauma. Look at Antony's facial expression and look at the speech balloons of the white man, who talking about Sri Lanka as this exotic space, and you must be missing your home in this cold weather. You've given a chance, won't you go back? And look at the expression on Antony's face, the shock of his expression. Okay, so that's what I meant by panel arrangement. Deliberately shows you how disconnected to Antony's reality is the white man. Okay, so it's also a critique of the West to non-Western histories. Okay, next slide, please. So you must also look at the visuals simultaneously. So I'm also commenting through those bullets there. So most of the time in a traumatized individual recalls a pre-traumatic past. It reminds of a peaceful time. So even at this point, if you look at the visual, it identifies the year. The Civil War was an ongoing reality then. But this is the prologue. Now the rest of the book, every chapter begins with this black page. Unlike that, the prologue begins with a page which is very calm and quiet, indicating a period, which was before that trauma. And notice how they identify their location, Champion Patna, year, strong sense of community. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, now this one, you have to look at this lady, where you say, this panel says, so you are Jaga's younger brother. This is Nelani, okay? Nelani is what we call foregrounded, while there is an action going on at the back, okay? So throughout this prologue, there is what is celebrated is community, sense of community. Everybody celebrates things together. What is being celebrated here? It is called Mavirar Dinam, which the LTT used to celebrate, celebrating people who have become martyrs in the war. Okay. Now, Nelani's expressions, you see how the graphic is able to communicate that. Everyone else is celebrating, but Nelani is worried. Now, Nelani is the first victim of trauma in this book. She has all the symptoms of trauma. So we are going to focus on her for a bit before, as we move on. So you have to keep her in mind. So Nelani has this, if you look at her expression, look at her eyes, everybody else is rejoicing at the back. Kids are happy to join the LGBT, but she knows the reality of joining this community. And so she's worried what's going to happen to her children. She's already, Jaga, the elder son, has already joined the movement. LTT is called the movement. So she's worried for her other children. So this fear is there. So even in this point where there is nothing going on, the trauma has not hit them, there is already an unassimilated fear. Okay, next slide. Okay, so Nelani is one focus in the prologue. Again, a lot of scholars, psychiatrists who worked with Vanni survivors talk about how they have two responses. So all of them don't go through what Freud says aberration. I mean, think about in our own lives, so people who believe or don't believe. We all believe, if we pray, things will become okay. Okay, and a lot of these psychologists also talk about these alternate healing practices. And one symbol, see, look, this is what I meant by icons. Can you see in the left to this left, the darker side where that's Antony sitting in his boat, he's a fisherman, how he hopes. So the fisherman's livelihood, he can't do anything, right? So he has faith that, there is somebody protecting him, right? So throughout this journey, you find that they have this faith, that God will protect them and things like that. So Daya Somasundaram and other psychologists tell us how Vanni survivors, even in their collective trauma, believed that, Kadavul Patupar, that is the Tamil phrase, that somehow God will help them, somehow God will protect them. Now, if you look at page number 258, the next picture, that is the end. So this is interesting, this is 28 is end of the prologue, 258 is the end of the epilogue. If you look at the last panel, that shows you the family acclave, right? You have the pictures of all the people who die. I mean, Antony loses everybody. He loses his mother to the war. He loses his son Michael to the war. So you have all the pictures, and above them you see the same icon of the cross is repeated. Okay. So that's what we mean by alternate practices. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to quickly comment on this. This is the first episode which leads to Nalini's trauma. And you have to watch the speech balloons and the panel. Okay, all the speech balloons are the Chulagars talking. Okay, so Jaga has lost his leg because he has stepped on a landmine. Now you will see how this kind of aggravates the trauma for this family. But notice the speech bubbles are also this, the facial expressions are all the expressions of Anthony Ramachandran's family, right? This again shows you the sense of bonding, sense of community. I'm reiterating this because the trauma begins when this community gets slowly shattered. Next slide, please. Okay, December 2004, all of you know what happens. The tsunami, the same sea now also becomes the cause of, you know, the collective getting shattered. Okay, yeah. Next slide. Yeah, this is the tsunami hitting them. You can see there are different panels which show you from different angles. The top one, look at the lengthy first panel to show you, because now Jaga can't run, remember, because he's lost his leg. And his father, Shegar, does not want to leave him. And you can see the horror of the children saying, the mother, the Nalini climbing up that, there's a church there, they're climbing the church roof. Watch the interplay of the visual and the verbal. That's why I said it's non-synchronously reading. And go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the back view of, you can see in this panel, back view of Jaga who can't run, Shegar who does not want to leave his son. And important is the last panel where you have Nalini's speech bubble. Notice speech bubble has nothing, has no words. And there are these ellipses, right? Now in the graphic, you also have something called emanata. Like, if you have a character crying, you have teardrops falling, right? So this ellipsis becomes her emanata. The graphic becomes an effective way of showing you how this is her mom, point of, this is where her trauma begins. This is her traumatic memory, right? And this has not got assimilated into her conscious memory. This remains unassimilated, unrepresented, non-narrated in her conscious memory. You will see how, so she has now lost her son, Jaga. She's also lost her husband, Shegar. In a way, this itself has been, the war itself has been responsible for this. So you will understand what we meant by, earlier I talked about repetition. You don't want the trauma to repeat itself. Now, what will happen to Nalini because of that? We will see in the next slide. Next slide. Okay, so this is the tsunami. You have a spread page showing you the tsunami. Next page. Next slide. Okay, now these are what we call two splashes. Okay, two pages. You can see the page number there. That is 39 and this is 51, I think. Look how the graphic captures collapse of a collective. Okay, for Nalini, the immediate community is her family. Look at the same visuals, same tree, same setting. It's the graphic which is able to capture that. In the second splash, everything is gone. A central symbol here would be, an icon would be the palmera tree. The palmera tree is very native to Sri Lanka. See how that has collapsed, right? You can say that the second splash, becomes the objective correlative to tell you what is going on in Nalini's amygdala. Now, in psychology, when we use the word amygdala is the point in your brain which retains the memory. Okay, so this is Nalini's amygdala, right? Notice there is no verbal representation. So there you have her family, everything, no verbal representation. Again, shock of what has happened. When you visualized a shocking episode, you're unable to talk about it, right? So again, that is what this is talking about. But the visual is able to capture that unrepresented, what is not represented in the verbal. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, now while you read the panels, now so the war has started. Okay, so the Sri Lankan army's bombing air raids have started. So I have jumped. I'm not going exactly according to the chronology of the book. I'm jumped to indicate my point. Now, in trauma studies, we are also told how a traumatized victim becomes victimizer. So, if you're reading the speech balloon, both the Chulagars and Antony family are in the same camp, and the LTT guerrillas come to forcefully conscript soldiers. Now, because she does not want to lose another child to the war, she quickly points out to Priya. Priya is, in fact, Antony's wife. Antony's wife, what is her name? Rajini's sister. Okay. So, because she does not want the children to be conscripted, she points to Priya, and Priya is forcefully conscripted. Once again, you can see how the panels indicate the trauma. Again, look at the last panel, no verbs to show, Rajini's grief. Can we go to the next one? That's the next one. Yeah, this is also the cover page of the book. I'm not able to see anybody's video. Is that fine? There's just a big blank screen here. Okay, so this is also the cover page of the book. It's a very important splash, because if you look at the visual, it shows you a complete break of community. So everybody's trauma comes back to the collective being lost. So Nalini's victimization is also because she's already lost a sense of collective. So that when the LTT comes, that becomes her trigger, right? We were talking about trigger. So it becomes a trigger for her trauma. Now look at the visual. There are a lot of tents, and one tent has collapsed. So this is Nalini packing up. She's so guilty now that she has made Rajini's sister also a victim. She leaves, and that's where the community, the collective shatters. Okay, yeah. So then the graphic becomes an effective medium to show collective trauma. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the war coming in 2007. Daya Somasundaram tells us how, all the survivors used to talk about the war as if it was coming from outside. All right, so it is always described as that. So the visual shows you that. Notice how everybody's back is towards us and the air raids are coming from outside. So the graphic is able to capture that. The smoke curling is again another important icon in the book. In the earlier part, when the collective when there is a sense of collective, these curling images of the smoke all indicate community, right? Coming from the hearth, people sitting around a fire, talking, and things like that. As the war explodes, the movement of the smoke is from the ground to the sky when there is a collective. In the latter part of the testimonial, the movement is from the sky to the ground, suggesting the breaking of the collective. The cause of the trauma lies in the skies. Yeah, next one, please. Okay, so these are all splashes in the book. You can move the slide to show you collective trauma. Next splash. Again, people moving together, right? Suggesting how this is not about an individual, but it is about a collective. Everybody moves together. Okay, next one. Okay, this is the Antony family fleeing the war zone. Can you see those objects flying from their bikes? Collective trauma also, because communities, when they were talking about their trauma, say how, in every camp, they would lose somebody. Each camp, they would lose somebody. Each camp, they would lose more and more things. So by the time they reached the last camp, they had nothing with them. They had no one with them. They had lost everyone. The objects flying from the motorbike also becomes indicative of what they kept, that these people kept losing as a collective. Okay, next one. Okay, these are vignettes in the graphic. This is a character called Indran. I have already explained it. So you can see how this is his traumatic memory. How, look at this panel, it has no gutter, right? To show you that he has not found any closure. The past remains unsolved at the back of his head. It's there, literally to show you the back of his head. Indran stands outside that memory, suggesting that he has had no closure. Traumatic memories repetitively come back to him. They intrude in form through visualization. So he also avoids triggering of this traumatic memory. But the war zone is a challenge because there is no way escaping this. So the graphic also becomes an effective way of challenging the West's idea of a single traumatic event. Because for Indran, there is no closure. Every camp, there is going to be another bombing, right? That is very specific to one, what happened in the one. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, now this is another vignette of two characters who rescue this boy. If you see the panel arrangement, um, the ones which are not jigsawed, you see, are his past, right? The ones which have regular panels, that is his present. So this is this young boy who has been, rescued by Prem and his wife. But if you see the other panel, which is jigsaw panel, those are his memories. Okay, that is his mother being shot. She dies. So look at how the graphic shows you the interplay of past and present, how the boy has not assimilated that traumatic memory. Also look at the loops from speech balloons. They don't reach the boy, suggesting how he has still not come to terms. He has not understood what has happened. Shape of the memory panel is also interesting. The memory of the color of the memory panel reverses the color of the present. The shape of the memory panel is not exactly thought balloons, right? They're not like a cloud. If you look at it carefully, they're more like jigsaw puzzles. Again, the graphic becomes an effective medium of showing how he has not, it's wrongly placed. How he has not pieced these memories together. So again, the graphic becomes an effective way of representing trauma. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one. Yeah, this is Antony in exile. So if you look, so there are a lot of parts in the exile which has no speech balloon.
Guys, please wait. Ma'am will be joining in a few minutes. It is just a technical glitch. Till then, you can put your queries in the chat box if you want. You can put your queries in the chat box. After ma'am's talk, she will be getting back to you on your queries. Until then, whatever query we have, also we will direct those to our ma'am.
Yeah, I'm back. That's good. I kept my other laptop on. Yeah, can you see me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
We
Okay,
can.
so communities in Excel. Can you hear me also?
Ma'am, can you just raise up your volume? I mean, it is audible,
Just a
but
second.
not like earlier. Yeah.
How about now?
Yes, ma'am. It is okay now.
Yeah, okay.
You can
Yeah.
proceed.
Okay, so this is so through the exile part of the narrative, you find this lot of panels which have no speech balloons at all. Again, you have the interplay of past and present. Um, all the panels, if you see, Antony is alone, which shows you the loss of a collective. Um, Psychiatrists tell us that in for these the people in exile, family members are the primary source of social and emotional support. um, Communities also become important resource for refugees. So you find that he's able to go back, he goes to England, and that itself happens because of family members there who help him to come to England. And in the exile, again, you will find panels which have you have speech balloons, but then they have nothing in it. So people are talking, but he can't understand because he's in again, to suggest his alienation, um, that he can't understand the language. lot of pages, lot of arrangements. Yeah, also resemble, earlier, you remember those slides we saw where you have Indran's slide and then this other boy's memory. So Antony's also, the graphic also shows us how he's also going through these traumatic things. But then, because he loses his mother, he loses his son. I'm not going through all that. It's a very long book. Okay, so yeah, so community becomes an important source for refugees, and refugees acquire, and Antony heals in the end because of a sense of collective being restored. A quick question. I think I've already overshot the time. Do we continue today or should we do another session for Munu? It's up to you. I will need at least another 15 minutes. It's up to you. We can, uh, I don't know how
Ma'am,
this works.
if you need 15 minutes, then we can conclude today itself.
Okay, but I'll do a rushed thing. Is that okay?
Uh, if you want to make another session, then we can arrange it. No problem.
No, I am okay with everything. So let me do one thing. Let me finish with this, with the next one also. So, but if the people want a more elaborate session for the other text and for this, then maybe we can do it again. Shall we do that? Okay, people say continue.
Ma'am,
Okay.
in the
Yeah.
chat box, please continue. Yeah,
Yeah.
so you
Okay.
can.
Okay. We'll
We
go to the
have
next.
time, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay.
We
We'll
can.
go to the next slide then. Okay. So we have now moved to the next comic graphic book. This is called Munu. This is the book. I will just show you the book here. This is the book. Okay, we are going to see all that now in a bit. Okay, you can read that. This is also, again, I'm not going to give you the history. Yeah, so he's a graphic artist. He lives in Srinagar. This is his famous book. Um, is his debut book, which is called Munu, a Boy from Kashmir. It was released in 2015, won this award. His inspiration comes from a story which was published by Vanni, who talks about the Kashmiri deers as endangered deers. That's called the Hangul deer. Okay, now the other influence for Malik Sajjad is also Art Spiegelman. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, where Spiegelman uses the icon of the mice to talk about the Jews. So Munu, Sajjad uses the Hangul deer to talk about the Kashmiris, and the Indian army are all hunters. Okay, so that's what you're going to see in the visuals. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so this is cultural trauma. So like I said earlier, I have specifically not used or not entirely used only Western model. I'm bringing in Western theoretical approaches. At the simultaneously, I'm very deliberately looking at non-Western theories. Okay, so this is cultural trauma. Um,
Sorry for the inconvenience, friends. Please wait. It's just a technical glitch. Ma'am will join us. Yes, ma'am. We can see you.
Not able to
And
unmute myself.
now we can hear you, ma'am.
You can? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, okay, fine. Because it says
Ma'am, please unmute yourself. Let me do it. Ma'am, now you can unmute. Is it? Yes, ma'am.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not able to open the screen at all. What is wrong with this? Okay, I'm just going to continue. Let's see if okay, if there is another technical glitch, then you'll have to give me 2 minutes to charge this other laptop and join. Is that fine? Because there
Yeah,
seems to
ma'am.
be some
No
problem with my
problem.
laptop as usual. Okay, okay. All right, so this is I can't see the slide because I'm something is wrong with my
Ma'am,
computer.
then let me stop the sharing and reshare it.
Okay. No, it's
Then
not
maybe
that.
you can.
Something is okay. Can you share it now? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Let me do that.
I think this is
Ma'am, can you see the screen?
yes. Okay, so now
Yeah.
can you go to the next slide? Okay, so see, cultural trauma we have to understand is very different from collective. Okay, collective trauma occurs when a sense of collective is gone. Cultural trauma is about a changed collective identity. Okay, and the book is about the cultural trauma of Kashmiri Muslims, and in fact, it also calls the Pandits also Hanguls, about their changed cultural identity because of systemic militarization of Kashmir. Right, so they have been reduced to the Hangul. Now, this is the cover page of Munu. Uh, Please note, and this is the entire book is going to use what is called graphic weight. Okay, so it's very heavy. The entire book is in black and white. If you look at the cover page, it's a tomb, right? And usually in the tomb, the epitaph is the name of the person who is dead. So here Malik Sajjas has written his name, suggesting that living in a war zone like that, he can die too anytime. And in this war zone, the Kashmiri Muslim specifically, is only a is an endangered species. Okay. Then there is a splash of blue. This is the only blue you will see in this book. This is the only color we see. So stands out in this cover page. Probably, I mean, critics have suggested that probably to suggest that the blue landscape, the mountains, the rivers, the Jhelum, the Himalayas, and all of that, a kind of landscape which is now completely lost in Kashmir. Okay, so when you look at this book and say, okay, there's a book about Kashmir, you will think that you're going to see houseboats and flowers and mountains and things like that. We will see what we're going to see. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to start in the middle of the book. This is a section called footnotes. Okay. Now in Munnu, the gutter is very important. Okay, the gutter, remember, is the space between the two panels, because a lot of things, the dark irony of this book is in the gutter. This is a section called footnotes, which talks about the history of Kashmir. Okay, now if you please look at the visual. Kashmir is reduced to, can you see, it's like two glaciers which have split apart. One side you have Pakistan, one side you have India, and you have occupation, militarization of the whole area. And there is no closure. The glacier is not coming together at any point at all, suggesting no closure. The cultural trauma in Kashmir is because of systemic oppression. If you remember that points which I have put down, That is the trauma of living in a militarized police state. This is what happens to the cultural identity, causing the cultural identity change. So hence cultural trauma. Irony in the gutter, it's only after you read the entire chapter that you understand why this chapter is called footnotes. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, now I'll give you a minute to look at this very complicated. So these are two spreads, okay? I've skipped pages, but 200 and 201, this is how it looks. Look at 200 and look at 201. There is a very clear difference in the visuals, okay? The entire book is like this, okay? Now, if you look at the visual, the one on the left, right, 200, it shows you the plural history of Kashmir. Kashmir's plural origin myths, shows you Kashmir's syncretic culture, right? How different people come in, everybody is learning. Kashmir is a center of knowledge, Kashmir is a center of culture, trade prospers. And importantly, notice there are no panels. It's only a spread, right? The panels all start in the next page, 201, right? So it shows, so the spread is used to show a harmonious, syncretic, pluricultural Kashmir, which was very syncretic. Division comes when outsiders come. So, and look at each panel. There is a Mughal, there are Afghans, and then there are the Sikhs. And if you look at the arrangement of the panel, these are long vertical panels. The arrangement is such that the oppressors are on top, and at every point, different Kashmiris are the victims. Towards the last panel, they're reduced to skeletons. Right? So division comes when outsiders come in, like you will see how when India comes in, Indian army comes in. Next slide, please. Okay, this is, I've jumped a few pages. I'm figuring that you can understand what this is talking about. Please look at the central panel, which has a kind of an inset. That's the partition, right? And you can see both sides are equally violent. There is death on both sides. Look how the graphic shows this brilliantly. There is the Indian flag, there's the Pakistani flag, there are skulls everywhere. Very interesting in terms of how it narrates history is the inset in that panel. Can you see on one side there is Nehru, the other side is Jinnah. Notice Nehru, though he claims to be a Kashmiri, he's not depicted as a Hangul. He's also depicted like a human. And look at their expressions. They're both cruel. They're both, this is what we mean by reading icons. Both cruel. These are the exact same expressions you will find as we get into this graphic, which will also be the expression of the Indian army. They have that, the eyes are, their eyes don't have openings at all. They'll all be, they're cruel and that kind of a, the Machiavellian expression. So you'll find that the graphic uses that visual to bring that about. Okay. Yes, next slide, please. Now, by that, now here, this is a much later slide. The entry of the Indian army into when Kashmir becomes an occupied space, right? Crackdowns begin, barbed wires. Look how the Kashmir's landscape changes. And for the first time, the tombstone icon enters the Kashmir identity. So from here onwards, it's only that identity that prevails. So there is a loss of all this thing of Kashmiriyat, what Kashmir originally was, to being reduced to a land of graves, killing, torture chambers, and all of that. Next slide. Okay, this is the opening page. Reading the graphic. Now, usually there is a, the graphic allows you to read it however you want, but usually we start from the left, move to the right, go from top to bottom, and then we go like that. So there's a kind of a Z that we do. So if you read that graphic like that, so that's the top one, which looks like a family photo, is the family of Munu, okay? And there are little speech bubbles, we'll come to that in a bit, which show you who they are. So if you do the Z thing, it comes to the last, the circular thing, that inset with which says Kashmir, right? So it's kind of the graphics way of communicating to us who is responsible for this cultural trauma, the oppressors. Now look at the inset, Kashmir is in white, all oppressors are in black. That's the white and black color play. I told you about graphic weight. This book uses a lot of graphic weight. What is graphic weight? Use of colors, or use of dark colors, or use of just black and white, increasing black to show you gloom, trauma, all of that. This book uses a lot of graphic weight. There's a lot of, dark images. We'll see that. Okay. Again, look at the speech balloons. They all end with a finger pointing. Once again, to emphasize cultural trauma in Kashmir, you have a figure called the Mukbir, right? Mukbir is the person who is the traitor. So the Indian army arrests somebody and tells him to point out who are the possible traitors, who are the possible terrorists, who are the ones who are supporting Pakistan. So the Mukbir is uh, a prototype that emerges after the Indian army occupation. So deliberately, the speech balloons use, at least I'm reading it that way, use that to show how everyone is, whoever anybody can become a mukbir. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is graphic weight. Can you see? Predominantly using black to show gloom, grief, darkness. What is being depicted here, I think the little captions there will tell you that. Mustafa dies because he is suspected to be a terrorist and he's shot. And this is his funeral. Okay, this is a spread. Look at the ceaseless flow of the hunguls. They're all hunguls. This is a, now there are two kinds of recollection that's happening here. This is Malik Sajjad remembering this particular episode. This is also Malik Sajjad trying to show you how as a young boy he remembered this. Okay, this itself becomes his PTSD, as you will see. Okay, so flux of traumatic memory suggested through the graphic weight and the flow of this hunguls, almost like series of dead bodies. Okay, next slide. Okay, again, this is not, if you notice, colors are reversed here. Notice how white becomes the border and black is the inner color. This is Sajjad, Malik Sajjad, Munu's nightmare. So he's having a nightmare. Look at the graphic weight to show you nightmare. This is a visual memory of the trauma that he's having, right? Something you can't duplicate. So it's a kind of a reflection of, and when you're taking this kind of a mirror image, right? So it's a reversal. Nightmare is a symptom of PTSD. The traumatic memory keeps repeating itself in the unassimilated consciousness, unassimilated unconsciousness, leading to pathogenic, memories. So that's what the graphic is showing you here. So I've already captioned it there, so you can connect it to the graphic visual. Yeah, next slide. Okay, now this ijtima is something that happens in the book. So there are a series of sections which talk about this guy's trauma. This is one example. I just gave you an example. So this Munu goes to this ijtima, which is a kind of a memorial service for a martyr. This turns out to be a bad idea because what happens is this episode becomes a trigger. Okay. Now remember, we are seeing all this through Munu's consciousness. Look how the graphic brilliantly shows us PTSD. The layout, the page layout, is a spread again, exactly like the previous two slides, right? The traumatic episode, traumatic memory of the episode, and a present which is going to trigger the traumatic episode. Okay. Look at the graphic weight again, predominantly black. Hand gestures again are something we read in graphic novel. All the elders, these are all his father, then the mullah and all of them, they're all praying to, to Allah. Whereas look at Munu alone, he is scared, right? The roses which are spread on the tomb, look.
Dear participants, please wait. It is a technical glitch only. Till then, you can just put your queries in the chat box. I hope you are enjoying our session. You can write yes in the chat box as well. It will give us some energy as well, right? Thank you. Thank you for uh, staying there, and your support is really valuable. 1 minute, please. Dear participants, please wait. Uh, Ma'am said that it will take 5 minutes only. Okay. Yes, Richa. These all CSRF lectures are being recorded, and you can find this recorded version in our Cultural Studies Research Forum YouTube channel. Let me share the link here, okay, so that you can use it. And also, we have a Cultural Studies Research Forum Telegram channel, so that you can also join there. Yes, ma'am is there. Ma'am, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah. Ma'am, can you see the screen? Dears, how many of you already have interest in this trauma study, or have you just tried to get into such research in trauma studies? Let us know. You can share. Oh, Shruti. Okay, that's good. You are pursuing your research on it. Oh, many of.
Can you hear
That's
me now?
great. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, there seems to be. Yeah, let me anyway set up this other system also. Give me a minute. Huh? There was some problem with this laptop only. Just give me 1 minute.
Yes, ma'am. No problem. That's good to see that many of you are pursuing your research on trauma studies. Hope this lecture by our Dr. Preetha Vashan ma'am will help you a lot. Yes, Richa. Let me share the link. Thank you, Anna Kamachi. Yes, dear Shiva Shiri, you can join our Telegram group for regular updates. Okay, there we are providing such newses, and of course we will try to get ma'am once again. Check the chat box, please, dear participants. I have shared the YouTube channel link and also the link for our Cultural Studies Research Forum Telegram channel. You can join. It is free for all. You can also share with your friends, family. Okay, and also you can join our Valat public group, which is in Telegram. If you are practicing, if you are preparing for NET or SET exam or any other exam related to English literature, our channel, Valat Public Group, will help you. Thank you for staying with us. And also, you can visit our bodhitripublication.org. There you can see our books under Bodhitri Publication, edited by Kallani Valat and the team. Sure, Anjali, we will. Thank you. Sure, dear. We will talk to Pritha ma'am and let you know. That's why I am asking to follow our YouTube channel and Cultural Studies Research Forum Telegram channel for getting updates. Yes, ma'am is there with us.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm surrounded by wires now, so I don't even know what is going where. Yeah, this is what I anticipated in the afternoon. Yeah, I shouldn't. And the problem was the rental people gave me the laptop. They didn't give me the charger, and the charger on this said that it is going to last for 3.5 hours. So he has left the charge outside. So sorry about that inconvenience. Okay, we'll get back. I'm holding you all
Okay,
up
ma'am.
very long, but I'm sorry about that. Yeah, they're two very vast works, and it's very difficult to cover the area, two different areas, bring them together, and then look at two texts. Maybe we should have done one text, one session, or something like that over an hour. It's unfair to both spaces. So, okay, so we were looking at this. I think we are done with this. We'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is again use of low angle. This is a story that he says, the priest, about how martyrs go to become, they get pomegranate trees, and if there's something that happens, but the graphic again shows you the low angle suggesting Munu's trauma and things like that. Short panel, can you see the shorter panel there, which shows you the tomb right at the end, right? Shows you unresolved trauma of the death that he could not go through. I mean, they cannot resolve, and also suggesting reliving of the traumatic memory, showing his severe emotional distress. Next slide, please. Yeah, leading to, you can see the last panel, avoidance, which is another symptom of PTSD. So Munu runs away from the place. Now, many psychologists who work with children, Kashmiri children who are living in Kashmir and facing everyday violence, many of them talk about how they have all the symptoms of PTSD that the graphic shows us. Okay, avoidance, triggers, nightmares, um, unresolved inability to resolve this conflict violence and things like that. So the panels again capture, if you see that hand trying to catch him, it's all showing you that flux of his memory, something which the verbal will not be able to communicate, the visual icons communicate. Also look at the graphic weight in that long rectangular panel. It's horizontal, see, instead of vertical is often used to suggest oppression, somebody bigger than you, looming over you. Horizontal panel is also shows you the expanse, the inability to understand, and the graphic weight again conveys this incomprehensibility of what is going on to him, the fear of what is going on to him. Now, after this, interestingly, in this book, yeah, you can go to the next slide. I think we've come to the end. Yeah, okay. Now, so both the graphics, so after this in the book, you will find Munu resorts to eating chalk, okay, and that's when he learns to draw, and he becomes a graphic artist and things like that, which is the point which I have said right at the penultimate point, scriptotherapy, which is writing to heal. So in this case, it also becomes graphic therapy. So the graphic helps him to bring closure. It also helps him to become resistant. He becomes a resistant artist. One kind of a subversive Bildungsroman where he does not grow up with the state. The state continues to be oppressed, but he goes to resist. So he uses his graphic form itself to write about the realities in Kashmir. Now, so both the graphic forms we have seen are recollections of traumatic memories. Now, both the graphic forms show us that narrating the traumatic memory gives some coherence to the traumatic memory. But why is the graphic form also relevant? Now, there are two things that are simultaneously present in a graphic form. There is the panel, which is actually the narration of the episode. And then there is a gutter between the panel, which is a gap, suggesting that can you come to can any traumatic memory become coherent at all? See, so such coherence is impossible, right? So the graphic allows that kind of non-synchronous presentation of, what, I can to some extent narrate this trauma, but then there are some things that are impossible to communicate, and that's what lies in that space between the panel, that is the gutter. Politics of representation. Benjamin, Dix, and Pollock are not Sri Lankans. They're not victims of the conflict. So what is there? So how can they talk about this? So that's why they call it non-fiction fiction. So they are not saying that, they're not appropriating voices. So that's why they call it a testimony. They're not appropriating voices. At the same time, they show you plural stories rather than single stories. Plus, the graphic itself allows this kind of, statement that they're not appropriating. If you remember the visuals, all these speech balloons have long loops. So there's a distance between the character speaking and them recording, suggesting that they're only recording the stories. They are not talking these stories. Similarly, the comic form is a postmodern form because repeatedly it draws your attention to its self-reflexive nature. You know that this is a panel. This is an art form. It's not mimetic, right? It is it's a metafictional form. So the self-reflexive form also rejects that kind of a appropriation. Malik Sajid calls his book a graphic novel, so he doesn't call it autobiographical. That's why you have that objectivity. Think about that footnote chapter. That chapter has, and like I said, irony is in the gutter, something that I didn't elaborate. That chapter, he calls it a footnote. Now that becomes a kind of a deconstructive comment to meta narratives of the two states. because his history is more plural, is more comprehensive, is more objective than state narratives, which are always one-sided. But his is, his is not unidimensional, it is pluralistic. So that's why, politics of representation, so objectivity comes in, because he's not talking about his story, he's narrating Kashmir's story. The the other reason how this challenges the Western model, both the books talk about not the psychologization of the individual, but the need for the state to address the event. There is no closure till the state acknowledges what it has done. In fact, Daya Somasundaram says that Sri Lankan government has not acknowledged what it did at Vanni. It has in fact, it has proudly claimed, I'm quoting him, not a single drop of civilian blood has been shed. And it called the Vanni biggest humanitarian rescue mission in history. So unless state is addressed, there is no closure to this trauma. So again, this completely throws out of the window the Western model that the individual talks, individual gets a cure. The individual talks, individual cannot get a cure unless the state, because it's the state who is responsible for what has happened to them. Okay, next slide, please. Last slide. Okay, now a graphic requires, like you must have experienced it now, a high degree of engagement with the graphic, right? As a reader, you need to have verbal literacy and visual literacy, right? And Hilary Shute, who quotes Sacco, the Palestinian graphic writer and artist, says the graphic has the power to detain, which means, I mean, I went very fast, I know, because there is only that much time. That's why I said it's very difficult to finish 2 in 1 hour. But you're reading, you're looking, and then you come back, and sometimes you're reading all over the place. Typically, I mean, we don't look at the first panel. It's not like how we read a book. You can look at the last panel and then come back and say, hey, what did I miss here? So, like the postmodern novel, the reader is also the writer of the text, right? So these are also, so you can bring in reader response theory also, because, and I'm going to pun on that reader response. Readers are also responsible readers. We're not just responsive readers, we also are responsible readers. So readers are also writers of the book, which becomes a double witnessing. The writer and the graphic artist have witnessed it once. Okay. Witnessed it once, but we are re-witnessing it again. So we are also responsible for what happens here. Okay. So active readers are also active agents of social change. So what we cannot be passive readers of a graphic. And that's why I've quoted from a scholarly paper and concluded this presentation with, what can we do? You see, what can we create in the gutter? We can create justice in the gutter, right? Can we find closure to traumatic histories? Closure cannot be found unless these external stressors are addressed. Process of repatriation commences. So active readers can become active agents of social change. And that's why justice lies in the gutter between the 2 panels. Yes, thank you. Yeah, you can.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm sorry for all that technical glitches.
No, ma'am,
Yeah.
it's okay.
Okay.
We can understand.
Yeah.
So we have some queries. The first one is from Priya Sharma.
Okay.
She is asking to suggest some writer for research synopsis on the trauma study.
What's synopsis?
Research. I mean, she can make a synopsis on her research.
Okay.
So can you just tell her some writer?
Yeah, I gave a whole lot there.
Asking for.
Okay, I gave a whole lot there. Kathy Karu, Shoshana Feldman. There were a whole lot. I mean, you can go back to the YouTube video and check. It depends on your texts again. If it's going to come from the global south, then you will have to talk about these people, bring in some of their theories, but you'll definitely also have to talk about this whole scholarship that's coming in. You have Laurie Vicroy, you have Steph Crafts, you have Irene Visser, Visser. These are all writers who are, talking about the need to post-colonize trauma, because too much of studies has happened, which is only focused on the Holocaust. You see, and they have derived a theoretical model based on Holocaust survivors' trauma. This is like the first wave of feminism, you see, which only addresses white feminism. It does not address the black woman's identity, or for that matter, you have now Dalit feminism, which is questioning third wave feminism. So these are all different models that have emerged in trauma studies itself. So those are some of the names. They were all there in the presentation. You can go back and check the video. You should get some idea. And I gave you some more. And all those terms which I had put down, they're all available on any of your, what can I say, authored sites. You're going to get any of these. You have a lot of psychologists writing about all of this.
Thank you, ma'am. Haley Doshi, she is asking that can you please tell a little bit about intergenerational transmission in trauma studies?
Yeah.
Also suggest some Indian novels related to the same topic.
Okay. So you have now again intergenerational trauma comes up because of Holocaust. Okay, specifically, and if any of you are interested in trauma studies and in the graphic, you have to read Art Spiegelman's Maus, Maus. Okay, that's kind of the cornerstone that has to be covered if you're going to do. Again, that comes from the West, but we don't have a choice. You have to read it if you're going to get into this area. Okay, now answering your question, Marianne Hirsch, Hirsch, Marianne Hirsch, has an essay called Post Memory. Okay, and that's available online, where she's discussing Spiegelman's Maus. Okay, Spiegelman, now RT is narrating his father's traumatic memory of the Holocaust. So RT is a victim in that book of intergenerational trauma. Okay, specifically Indian authors who write about intergenerational trauma, you will have to look for partition writers, later partition writers. I can tell you a couple of books of my just like that. One is there is this book which has not got much visibility. It's not available now because they've taken it off, but I can send you a copy. It's a book by this writer, a good friend of mine. I'm not promoting her book, but it is a very good book. It's called it's by Rima Modgil. The book is called Perfect Eight. Okay, now Rima Modgil's mother was a partition survivor. So in this book, in the first, the latter part of book sort of gets into a kind of a romantic bind and all that, but it's a very interesting book. But the first part of the book, the narrator, first person narrator, she has intergenerational trauma. I have a paper, it should be available online, on trauma and memory in Rima Modgil's Perfect Eight. It's available online. Yes, Toni Morrison's Beloved also discusses intergenerational trauma. You're absolutely right. I'm just seeing that question. But since you wanted an Indian author, this will work. Another writer, it's pretty well known. One of my students worked on it also. This is a book called Madness. Madness and Other Stories. The name of the author is Anirudh Khala. Anirudh Khala also has published a recent book which is about the anti-Sikh violence or the violence in Punjab. You have to check. But Anirudh Khala has this collection of short stories which is about intergenerational trauma of partition survivors. So partition is something you can definitely think about. Even writers, Kashmiri writers, Pandit writers, current Pandit writers, if there are, but most of them have seen 1989. So that would not be intergenerational trauma.
Can we say Cry the Peacock comes under this?
Sorry?
Cry the Peacock by Anita Desai.
Cry the Peacock. I think one of the characters, Unsafe Asylum, you're correct. Unsafe Asylum by Anirudh Khan. One of the characters, right? Not all of them. I don't remember this Cry the Peacock. Cry the Peacock is not that one about those three people. No, that is Bye Bye Blackbird is the diasporic. Which one is Cry the Peacock? I forget which is Cry the Peacock, so I'm not able to answer the question. Can we incorporate? Yes, there are many of people who are doing a graphic. There is a graphic book on partition. Uh, Unfortunately, it has become colossally expensive. It's called This Side, That Side. That has a lot of things on intergenerational power. Can you please suggest? Yeah, can you read out those questions for me? They're running away very quickly. Yes, Koyal,
Yes,
the next.
yes, ma'am. Yeah. Next question, VG is asking, can you please suggest any trauma theory books and famous libraries that have trauma books? Online too.
Yeah, online you're going to find most of these books are very expensive. There is Cambridge Companion to Trauma Studies. There is Post-Colonizing Trauma. You have to just go and search. There are plenty of books. Uh, there is uh, there is a new essay collection which is called South Asian Studies and Trauma that has come out. Yes, you can, but you know what? Rupam Chakraborty. See, the thing is, I don't know what is the problem. Okay, some examiners panels have a problem when you use Western theory to understand non-Western cultural context. Okay, so somewhere with the help of your guide, you will have to bridge that. Say that this is going to use that model and this model. You'll have to bridge that. But yes, Dalit, it's now like somebody had asked Maya and Toni Morrison. So remember in that I had said Native American Aboriginal literature also can look. You can look at trauma studies is prevalent there also. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, Koel, you
Yeah,
can
ma'am.
go to the next question, please. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Utsa, she is asking, apart from graphic novel, how can one represent trauma in narrative fiction?
Unreliable narrator. Okay. Try if you are you familiar with Ishguro? Ishguro all the time uses unreliable narrative. Any first person
Okay.
narrative set against conflict zone is unreliable. Okay, you
Thank you,
have
ma'am.
put up a lot of names. I'm not familiar with all of them. Okay, I am quite limited in terms of. I mean, I also have limitations. What I'm trying to say. Yes, Koel.
Yes, ma'am. One person is asking that can you suggest something on application-based research on trauma and healing, like addressing trauma and finding out various methods to cure it?
Yeah, then you will have to do a quantitative research, discuss with psychiatrists, uh, that's what you'll have to do. So visit psychiatric organization like in Bangalore, you'll have to visit NIMHANS, get in touch with a department of psychology. If you want to do an application based, then you'll have to have case studies. Yes, you can associate it with diasporic literature as well, because a lot of diasporic literature looks at exile, right? There is this graphic novel called Vietnam America, which is about the Vietnam conflict and exile from there on. So yeah, exile definitely. Did that answer somebody's question?
Thank you.
Yeah, application-based learning. Yeah. Okay, next question.
Uh, Ma'am, I think we shall wind up because it's
Okay.
already, yes, about to 8.
Okay.
And whoever has some questions, okay, they can send it to me. I will just forward it to ma'am and we will have the answer from ma'am, okay?
There are some of my
Ma'am,
old students
many of
here.
them,
Yeah, I can see names, but they're all disappearing
uh,
somewhere. Yeah. Okay.
mhm. Ma'am, many of them are asking for your email ID. Can I share with them?
Yes, but I won't check it very often. But definitely please mail me. Yeah, Chandri, yeah, I figured. Yeah, I saw your name. How are you? Hope you're fine. Somebody else also said listening to you after 19 years, so I don't know who that was.
Such a great thing, ma'am.
Okay.
And so now, uh, Such an enlightening session it was, and I'm really happy to have been a part of this talk. And now I would love to call Ashwati Di, just to give you a formal vote of thanks. She is also a part of our wallet. Hi, Ashwati Di.
Hi, Koel.
See.
Hi.
Hello, ma'am. So, good evening, everyone. So, on behalf of Cultural Studies Research Forum, I would like to express my deep gratitude to our esteemed guest, Dr. Prida Vasan. Ma'am, it was an amazing and illuminating session, ma'am. Thank you so much. The session was so interesting. It is packed with information. Despite all the technical glitches that we encountered in between, we can see that the participants were eagerly waiting for the lecture to continue. That itself says everything. You
Okay, thank you.
really, thank you, ma'am. Thank you for elaborating. You in detail, you elaborated the nuances and the aspects of trauma and how it is represented via graphic, and you really unraveled the potential and the possibilities for further research in the area, ma'am. And we really look forward to have many more sessions with you, ma'am. And some of the participants were also demanding that. And really, no, I must recommend that no one should miss this session. And you can, this video is available in our YouTube channel, and you can use this as a referral video for your further research in the area. And once again, thank you, ma'am. Now I would like to thank someone who is not physically present here. That is, but she is always a constant source of inspiration for us. And that is none other than the CEO of Vallat Education, Dr. Kalyani Vallat. Thank you, Kalyani ma'am, for always supporting and encouraging all our ventures. Now, I would like to thank our participants. They really they enriched this session with their thoughtful and pertinent questions. And also, I must thank you for patiently, you really endured so well with the technical problems that encountered in between. Thank you, dear participants. And finally, I would like to thank all the members of Cultural Studies Research Forum and the entire team Wallet. Thank you, dear participants, and thank you everyone who is present here. Good night. Keep learning with Wallet.
Okay, thank you
Thank
so
you
much
so
for
much.
that very beautiful vote of thanks, Ashwati. Koel, you can share the other mail ID. This my college ID I don't check often. My other
Okay,
personal ID,
okay,
you can
ma'am.
share. Yeah. I also want to thank Team Vallat and all the participants, my students who have joined, my old students who are still here. Okay, thank you, Rushati, for that introduction. Thank you, Koel. You are such a patient, pleasant person. I would have lost my patience by now, got fuzzled, whatever. But thank you so much. And I'm extremely sorry for this technical bizarre, giving you technical trauma, if I might say. All right. Going in out of
No,
one
ma'am.
computer, coming into one computer. Yeah. So I anticipated that and got something. But yeah, I was supposed to talk only for an hour, but this is the problem with an area like this, because we are bringing in two completely wide areas, two different books. So I think the next year maybe we should be wiser and make it into broader sessions so we can have a more closer engagement with the text. Okay. Thank you, Richa. Yeah.
Sure, ma'am. We would love to have you once again in our Cultural Studies Research
Thank you.
Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, with ma'am's permission, I am ending this session. Thank you, one and all. Bye.
Thank